Welcome everyone. Good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending upon where you're from. On behalf of the Poultry Professional Society, I warmly welcome you all to our third webinar with Dr. Laura Dixon from Scotland's Rural College. So thank you very much, Dr. Dixon, for joining us. This series is designed to bring together leading experts and professionals to share knowledge, experiences, and insights that can shape the future of poultry science. So before we officially begin, let me share a few housekeeping notes. Kindly keep your microphones muted during the entire session to avoid interruptions. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available within a week on our official YouTube channel. If you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the chat box at any time. All questions will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and that session will be co-moderated by Ms. Anika Imtiaz, who is our research and academic coordinator at PPS. So let me give a brief introduction of our today's speaker, Dr. Laura Dixon. She has been researching animal behavior and welfare for over 20 years with a specialization in poultry. Her current research involves assessing the importance of different resources and conducting welfare assessment of poultry. She works closely with broiler breeding companies and animal charities in the UK, USA, and Europe to assess the welfare of different breeds of broilers and their suitability for different production systems and food retail schemes. Laura is a senior lecturer and is involved in teaching on BSc and MSc programs as well as PhD supervision, and is the outgoing program director for the MSc International Animal Welfare, Ethics and Law, run jointly with the University of Edinburgh, UK, which provides the knowledge and skills to understand animal behavior, ethics, law from a global perspective using science-based evidence. Dr. Laura is also involved in the creation of new courses and programs focusing on animal behavior and welfare, and lectures to vet and vet nursing students to ensure they have an appropriate foundation in behavior and welfare for their future careers. Aside from poultry, Laura is interested in research relating to pet rabbits and shelter dogs and has supervised numerous students' projects over the years, ranging from bears to sea lions. So thank you very much, Dr. Laura Dixon, for joining. So without further delay, it's my privilege to invite Dr. Laura Dixon to please present her talk on advancing poultry welfare, practical insights from broiler and layer research. So it's over to you, Laura Dixon. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Nice to see you. I am just going to share my screen so you can see my slides. So please just give me a moment to get that working.
Okay.
Whoops, we'll just do that. That's safer. Can someone confirm that you can see my slides?
Okay. It's on the screen. Thank you.
Super. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about ways we can advance poultry welfare, but specifically looking at insights into recent poultry welfare research. Before we begin, I just want to talk to you about what welfare encompasses. Different people have different definitions of welfare, but in general, we consider welfare to encompass the physical health of the animal, the mental health of the animal, and also the behavioral opportunities offered to that animal. And so when we're looking at welfare, we can assess for both negative experience or the absence of negative experiences, but also importantly, we want to look for positive experiences or indicators that the animals are experiencing positive affective states, pleasure, contentment, so on. So we aren't going to be able to encompass every aspect of behavioral opportunities for our production animals like poultry. So we need to make decisions about what aspects are the most important to ensure good welfare for poultry. And of course, that's where poultry welfare science comes in. But we also, within this field, need to consider practical limitations on these because it is a business. It needs to be economical, and also, especially these days, we also need to think about sustainability. So we're going to begin with laying hens, and I just want to give an overview of some of the key welfare issues with laying hens, in case some of you aren't as familiar with welfare problems as others might be. So when we do laying hen welfare research, issues that have been identified are the availability of suitable nesting sites. Ideally, nesting sites for poultry would include a substrate, it'd be secluded, it'd be enclosed. They need access to appropriate perches, and that includes things like the height of the perches as well as the shape and the material the perch is made of. With laying hens especially, injurious pecking can be a problem, so there might be aggressive pecking, but there can also be feather pecking, cannibalism, and then beak trimming, which is often used as a strategy to reduce damage by feather pecking. Laying hens can have damage to their keel bones, which is similar to the sternum in people. This could be bone deviations or even bone breaks in the keel. They can suffer from foot pad issues like bumblefoot, which is a swelling, and pododermatitis or foot pad dermatitis, which is lesions on their feet. And of course, they're susceptible to diseases. I'm sure you're all very familiar with things like avian influenza, but also infectious bronchitis, Newcastle's disease, and so on. Laying hens, when they get towards the end of their cycle, have weakened skeletons. When a laying hen produces an egg, we not only supplement the feed with calcium, they also extract calcium from their bones to deposit as part of the calcium in the eggshell. So by the end of the lay period, they will have weakened skeletons, and they might have something called cage layer fatigue syndrome, which is really similar to osteoporosis in people. And they might also be susceptible to internal laying. So instead of coming out of the hen, the egg goes into basically the abdomen of the hen, and this can lead to infections. I'm going to go into a bit more in this talk about feather pecking and ways to mitigate it. So for those of you who aren't familiar, feather pecking is basically the pecking of feathers and possible removal of feathers of one bird by another. So feather removal is painful for the recipient. Any damage to the feathers can lead to increased pecking by other birds. And if there's any tissue damage or bleeding associated with feather removal, this can stimulate cannibalism. As well, the stress associated with this can increase disease susceptibility in the poultry. And birds that are being feather pecked also have lower productivity, they eat more food, and they have higher mortality rates. So it is also a production issue as well as a welfare issue. So the reasons hens feather peck are multifactorial, but it mainly seems to be related to the lack of suitable foraging opportunities, as well as related to any kinds of stress or changes in the environment. And often these are factors that reduce the ability of the birds to perform normal foraging behavior. Now, feather pecking's been around for a long time, and so has research on feather pecking. And there's lots of advice out there on how to manage or prevent feather pecking. For example, in 2013, the University of Bristol put out this feather well report, giving a series of recommendations in the different stages of lives of laying hens to try to reduce the risks of feather pecking. And the advice includes things like keeping your rearing and laying environments as similar as possible, not stimulating the birds into lay too early, trying to ensure they have access to good quality litter, providing things to peck at like pecking blocks, using mash, not pelleted feed, trying to ensure you have even birds' weight and sizes, and so on. But it's still a key welfare issue, and it's found in all types of housing systems. So both your cage systems and your non-cage systems can have feather pecking outbreaks. And research from the last 20 years indicates that between 24 and 94% of flocks show feather pecking. There is the potential for more hens to be harmed via feather pecking in burn systems because there's more birds available to peck at a particular victim. Whereas in a cage system, you can only peck at the birds within your cage. So the number of birds being affected is just reduced by those parameters. However, there's also a global shift to increase cage-free production, which means we are going to be seeing more and more birds in non-cage systems in years to come. And it's still a very prevalent research topic in poultry welfare, despite it being researched for decades already. So if we just looked at papers and abstracts from 2021 to present, there's been over 1,400 papers and abstracts that involve feather pecking in some way. So this is still a very key research issue in poultry welfare. So beak trimming is generally used as a way to reduce the damage of feather pecking. And in just basic terms, beak trimming is removal of the beak tip. This can be done by an infrared laser or hot blade trimming. But beak trimming in itself is a welfare issue and a concern. So being trimmed is painful. It reduces ability to perform normal behavior. And while some birds look really good after being beak trimmed, so the bottom left picture is a really nicely beak trimmed bird. The bird on the right has had regrowth to her lower beak. This will impact her ability to eat, and it might mean that she might need to be retrimmed in the future, which again would lead to more pain. As well, beak trimming doesn't actually stop the underlying causes behind feather pecking. It just makes it more difficult for birds to do damage to each other through pecking. So some countries have actually already banned beak trimming, like Germany. Others have considered banning it, but they ended up not going ahead, so the UK did this. And just to note that organic labeled flocks generally cannot be beak trimmed, so there are flocks out there that are being managed with intact beaks that we can also learn lessons from. So recently there's been research looking into alternatives to beak trimming, because beak trimming is a welfare issue, but it does also mitigate the damage from feather pecking. So there's been various groups looking at something called beak blunting, which is basically using an abrasive material that the hens peck at, and they'll wear down their beak tips naturally, so they're not as sharp and pointy. So you could do this by putting abrasive material in the feeder, so as the birds feed, they're wearing the beaks down. And there's been mixed results on this. Some studies have found that beak length was decreased, but other studies found no help. Also, when you're looking at feather cover, which is a proxy for feather pecking, so birds that are being pecked at have either bald patches or damaged feather areas, and we can assess this looking at feather cover instead of the behavior of feather pecking. And beak blunting didn't really seem to make a positive difference with the abrasive material in the feeder for feather cover. Other studies have looked at hanging pecking boards with abrasive material, so it's a type of enrichment. But again, these didn't seem to reduce the beak length or sharpness. Birds that had this additional enrichment in their cages did seem to perform less feather pecking, but again, it didn't affect feather cover. So there was no clear positive effect on beak sharpness or feather pecking by using beak blunting as an alternative to beak trimming. Another new area of research is looking at natural variations in beak shape of hens. So the shape of the beak does seem to be heritable to some degree, and mainly the focus has been on the upper beak. So if we're looking at hens, even within a line, the upper beaks can range in shape and size from long and narrow with more pointed tips to short and wide with more curved tips. And hens with naturally shorter and blunter upper beaks tend to have improved feather cover and also improved mortality. But because beak size and shape can differ between genetic lines of hens, we need to do more research to see how it's affected by the type of hen you're using. So I'm going to talk about some recent research by Sarah Struthers. Sarah did her PhD with us at SRUC, and she's now doing a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh. So she was quite interested in the variations in beak shape, and she looked at two different lines of hens. And she did find that the beak shape differed between the lines. And between the lines, the heritability for the upper beak shape was moderate to high for one line, but only low to moderate for the other. And because we're talking about heritability and beak shape, I just want to note that there has been research into looking at the heritability of feather pecking behavior, and this has a low to moderate heritability. The problem with selecting for feather pecking is that you need to observe the birds, identify the birds who do the feather pecking and those who don't, and then incorporate this into your breeding programs. This is quite challenging and time-consuming, and so while in theory we could select for lines that genetically feather peck less, practically this doesn't seem to really be able to happen. So it might be much easier to measure and select for beak size and shape than to actually look at the feather pecking behavior itself. Sarah then did another study asking if the natural variation in beak shape affects the ability to cause pecking damage. So she had two groups of birds, those with sharp beaks and those with blunt beaks, and she recorded them pecking on a feather's skin. So she looked at the number of pecks and the damage that the different beak types did to the feather skin, and both types of birds performed the same number of pecks. Perhaps not surprisingly, the sharp-beaked birds removed more feathers and caused more tissue damage to the skin, so sharp beaks are more effective at causing damage. But this also shows that selection for naturally blunted beaks within a line could be a practical and effective way to reduce the feather pecking damage without beak trimming. And Sarah is still continuing this work in a postdoc, and the breeding companies, the Langhen breeding companies, are also quite interested and have been involved in supplying birds and facilities for this research as well. Now, just to note, this research is really useful, and I think it has a lot of promise to help with feather pecking, but we still need to have good housing and management practices to reduce the risk of feather pecking as well. So we can't throw away everything else we've learned about managing feather pecking. Next, we'll talk a bit about the current broiler welfare research. And again, just to bring you up to speed on the main issues with broiler welfare, these are mainly related to their fast growth genetics. So broilers have increased rates of lameness, they have increased mortality levels, they're susceptible to foot and hock lesions, they are susceptible to metabolic diseases like ascites and flip over, they might suffer from heat stress, they might have muscle myopathies or degeneration of muscle. They also might be susceptible to some diseases like Campylobacter or necrotic enteritis, for example. So when we're looking at research to improve broiler welfare, this often focuses on the stocking density or number of birds in the environment, and also the enrichments provided in the environment. So if we're looking at stocking density, if we can lower the stocking density, this can often improve health outcomes, and it was also shown to improve productivity traits. It reduced the foot pad and hock lesions, it reduced aggressive interactions between the birds, and it reduced the risk of the birds suffering from lameness. And then if we add enrichments, and enrichments for broilers tend to be things like straw bales or platforms, these can help to stimulate natural behaviors and increase locomotion in the birds. It also reduced their fear responses of people, and again, it improved their foot health, so they had fewer foot pad lesions. However, when we're putting enrichments in for broilers, we have to be aware that as the broilers grow and gain weight, this can limit their ability to actually use enrichment items like perches. So the enrichments we provide need to be usable for the birds all through their production period, even as they grow and get quite heavy. And just to show you an example of adding enrichment to broilers, this study added straw bales, which is the A in the picture. They added low platforms, which is the B, and they also included laser projectors, which was quite novel. So these laser projectors were set on timers, and for a couple minutes, every couple hours, they projected a red dot onto the ground that moved around to try to stimulate the birds to engage with it. And the birds in these enriched environments showed increased exploratory behavior and comfort behavior. Now, comfort behavior is things like perching or preening, or dust bathing, and we associate increased comfort behaviors with positive welfare. These birds also had better foot pad scores. Again, they had reduced fear of humans. They also showed reduced muscle damage on their backs, and this muscle damage in the back can be a source of carcass condemnation, so it was also an improvement for a production trait. Also, providing the enrichments and giving the birds more to do didn't affect their growth rate, so birds in the enriched environment still weighed the same at day 42 as birds in non-enriched environments. So there are some improvements when we decrease stocking density or add enrichments, but overall the welfare improvements tend to be low compared to doing something like changing the growth rate of the birds. So for example, in that last study I mentioned, rate of locomotion increased from 3.41% with no enrichment in the environment to 5.03% with enrichment. And if we looked at dust bathing, that increased from 0.12% with no enrichment to 0.27% with enrichment. And then there was no difference between the environments in some behaviors like preening, foraging, eating, or drinking. They also found that age can have a bigger effect on some behaviors than whether or not there was enrichment present. So locomotion decreased from 5.12% when the birds were 13 days old to 2.45% at 42 days. So this is a bigger decrease in locomotion than the benefit that was shown between the enriched and the non-enriched environments. So reducing stocking density and or providing enrichment can improve some aspects of broiler welfare. But if we really want to improve broiler welfare, we need to start thinking about slower growth genetics. So when I'm talking about slower growth genetics or slower growing broilers, there's currently a variety of breeds that can be used commercially, and they can be used in anything from barn to free range to organic systems. And they're slaughtered between, say, 56 and 81 plus days. Obviously, that depends on the market they're providing for and the size and weight of birds that the retailers want. These slower growing broilers right now are required for higher welfare food schemes. So in the UK, we have the RSPCA Assured food scheme, and you have to use an approved slower growing breed to be part of this scheme. Of course, though, these birds are more expensive to produce. They eat more, and because they grow more slowly, you can produce fewer crops of chickens per year in your production system. But the welfare improvements are quite clear. So slower growing breeds have decreased mortality, decreased lameness, decreased foot and hock lesions, decreased muscle myopathies, which also relate to decreased slaughter downgrades. They have increased activity, and they're more adaptable or robust to different environmental conditions. And this is all compared to conventional faster growing breeds. So just to give you some examples of the differences we might see, in this graph in yellow, we've got a slower growing breed, and the green and the blue bars are standard faster growing broilers. And this was done in a research setting, so the mortalities aren't quite the same as you would see on farm. But overall, the slower growing breeds had significantly lower mortality. And now mortality is a welfare concern, but it's also a production concern. So these birds in the blue and green bars are being brought onto the farm, they're eating food, and then they're dying before they get to the slaughter plant, so they're not resulting in sellable product. And the mortality is higher in early life and higher near slaughter age for the standard broilers. Next, we'll look at white striping. So these are what it sounds like. There's white stripes along the breasts. If they're bad enough, again, this can be downgrading. And there's some association with severe white striping and welfare concerns as well. So again, in the yellow, we have our slower growing breed, and the blue and the two shades of green are the faster growing breeds. And we score white striping. It's generally a 0 to 3 scoring system. In this study, there were no score 3s, but 0 is no stripes at all, and 2 is a moderate level of striping. And you can see that your slower growing birds had almost all the birds with no white striping on their breasts, whereas for our faster growing breeds, the majority had a score of 1. So again, this could be improvement in welfare, but it could also be an improvement in a production parameter. So if we use a broiler breed whose growth is slowed, we can have large effects on broiler welfare. But from a practical point of view, they eat more food, fewer crops can be produced per year, and the muscle tissue yield is less. And even if you're slaughtering them at the same weight as a faster growing bird would be slaughtered. But mortality is better, the meat quality is better, so you get fewer downgrades, and you can often get a premium price for using a slower growing breed. So they're definitely not as economically viable as a faster growing breed, but the exact difference between how much it would cost to use one or the other, it's not quite as clear at the moment. So this is where the development of intermediate growth broilers has come in. Now, you might hear them called moderate growth or medium growth as well, but they're being developed as a compromise between birds with good productive traits and good welfare traits. So typically we might define a fast growth broiler as growing 60 or more grams per day. Slow growth is usually considered to be growing 40 grams per day or less, and the intermediate breeds might grow between about 45 and 55 grams per day. Now, these definitions, again, might differ a little depending on the source they're using, but just to give you a range of what we mean by the different growth rates. So our intermediate breeds won't take as long to reach slaughter weight as the slow-growing breeds. and they won't consume as much feed, and you can produce more crops of them per year in your sheds than you could a slow growth bird. But can the welfare be maintained? Because I'm coming at this from a welfare perspective. And I just wanted to give you some examples of the breeds that are currently available. And as I said, this is an ongoing area of research, and new breeds are being developed or in the works all the time. So if we were saying that we wanted to slaughter birds at about 2.5 kilos each in an as-hatched flock, we'd have the standard faster growing breed being slaughtered at around 42 days. And at the upper end with our slow growth birds, we'd have a couple that would be 56 days or more, and these birds would also be more likely to be used in free range or organic systems. But then we've got these breeds in the middle, and again, there's a wide range in them. So you might have breeds that might take 47 days as opposed to 42, 48 days, or maybe even up to 54 days. So when we compare the intermediate and slow growth breeds, some intermediate breeds do have similar levels for welfare measures when we compare them to the slow growth breeds. So for example, a number of breeds have been found to have similar levels of lameness as very slow growth birds, similar levels of footpad lesions as slow growth birds. Although sometimes we do find that the welfare measures might be higher or worse in the intermediate breeds, but they're still much better than a faster growth breed. So in general, the intermediate growth breeds have reduced lameness compared to the faster growing breeds, but they might not have as low levels of lameness as our very slow growing breeds. One of the issues, though, is that there's still limited research on many slower growing intermediate breeds. But it is, as I said, a growing area of research, and this is due to the improved welfare of intermediate growing birds, but also the improved production measures compared to the very slow growing breeds. And there's lots of growing interest in their use by various animal welfare charities, retailers, governments, and even some producers. Additionally, right now there's increased promotion of higher welfare chicken. So you might have heard of the Better Chicken Commitment or the European Chicken Commitment, where countries pledge to join this commitment to make changes to improve broiler welfare. And one of these changes is the use of an improved, slower growing or higher welfare broiler breed. And some of these intermediate breeds are being submitted and approved for these schemes. However, there's still lots of work to do in this area because the intermediate breeds do vary in their welfare outcomes. Some have much more welfare promise than others, but overall, these breeds generally are improvements to your traditional faster growing breeds. And we really do need more research on specific breeds. If certain breeds are going to be recommended or approved, we have to ensure that while they're producing well, that their welfare is also maintained. But it's a very promising area for improving broiler welfare. So this lets broilers have better lives, while also maintaining economically viable production levels, as well they have improved sustainability matrix compared to very slow-growing breeds. And the last thing I wanted to mention is increases in automatic monitoring. And we'll go over this briefly, but again, it's an upcoming area of research in poultry welfare that I think will have lots of benefits in the future. So we can use automated behavior monitoring as a way to assess welfare. We often use behavior as a welfare indicator right now, and we might look at things like increased expression of positive behaviors, so things like perching or preening or dust bathing, and we might also be looking for decreased expression of negative behaviors, so things like aggression or feather pecking. But like I mentioned earlier, human observation of poultry behavior is very time-consuming, and it's very difficult if we're going to start trying to apply this commercially in large flocks. So only a proportion of the birds are ever going to get observed, and our observations are only going to cover limited periods of time. We can't be in there trying to observe birds 24/7. It just doesn't end up being practical. So animal welfare does involve group welfare or flock welfare, but animal welfare also involves individual welfare. So ideally, we would want to monitor all animals to ensure good welfare, but this isn't practical in our flocks of thousands or tens of thousands of birds. And we could have some measures that we do at a flock level to indicate overall flock welfare. That could still be useful. But the ongoing increase in research and application of automatic methods to assess poultry behavior and welfare can be a way that we get more individual welfare included. And I'm just going to talk about a couple examples. So there's been an increase in the number of wearable sensors that animals can have, and these would track location and activity of individuals. For poultry, they're not common commercially, sometimes due to the size of the tracker versus the size of the bird or the cost of the equipment. You can get around the size though, so radio frequency ID microchips can be used, and these can be implanted in the birds. And there's been research looking at the RFID tags and bird behavior, and the birds only had a short-term impact on their behavior as they adjusted to wearing the tags. So again, these could potentially be used without impacting the birds themselves. And whether or not that's practical, though, based on the number of birds, is a different issue. But these types of sensors allow you to look at the location of the animal relative to resources, so we can estimate the behavior that they're doing. And you can even do fancy things like pairing these with, say, egg detection sensors, so you can associate egg laying with an individual. And we can use these to assess things like nest site preference. So which nest sites are being used the most, and this could be in a commercial facility potentially. How many birds are using a nest site at the same time. And you can do things like adding or removing pieces of equipment or structure of the nesting site to see if that improves use. And so we can use this to improve poultry welfare by improving nest box design. If we had a free range flock, we can also use these to monitor range use. And again, we can use it to assess changes or additions to see if we can improve bird use or improve bird use in certain areas. So is this technology eventually going to be practical in commercial systems? As the technology advances and gets more common, the cost is certainly decreasing. There's potential for even doing things like automating RFID microchip insertion at a hatchery. But still, is this going to be practical for thousands or tens of thousands of birds? Or can we maybe monitor a certain proportion of them enough to identify issues? So a compromise between just a purely flock level and individual welfare. And that's something that, again, needs more research to determine where that kind of range might be. So how many birds might we need to track or observe to still get an accurate representation? But the benefit of this is it does have the potential to improve welfare in real time. And it's much more practical than manually observing bird behavior, which is what we tend to currently do. We can also use image processing. And of course, this can be used on the flock level, and it is in some cases already being done. So you can look for changes in activity of the overall flock, changes in bird distribution throughout the shed or the environment. But it's starting to be used on individuals as well. For example, it can be used to look at footpad scoring. Now, assessing footpads is time-consuming. You have to go in, you have to pick up the bird, you have to flip it over, look at its feet, record it down on paper or in your computer or tablet. And this is why footpads are often assessed at the slaughter plant when the birds are hanging on the line already and the feet are readily visible. But of course, this means we can't improve welfare of the flock in real time. It's too late to improve welfare. And they'll just have to learn from this for the next flock. But we could incorporate machine learning into this to automate the process, which could allow welfare improvements for the flock in real time. So Bist and colleagues looked at doing this in an experimental setting. So they put a camera inside a transparent box, and they collected normal images, so your red, blue, green, blue images, and they also collected thermal images of the hen's feet, and they manually scored these. And then they took computer models and trained them to predict the footpad score. And then they tested their models. And they found that the models were pretty successful at the footpad scoring. Of course, there's some variation within models and variation within the training time it took to teach the models about footpad scoring. And there's still some challenges here or things that need to be worked out if we're going to extrapolate this to a larger commercial environment. So birds might have manure or litter on their feet. This is going to make it difficult to score. Commercially, if we were just to put this camera in and ask it to identify footpad scores, we're not identifying individuals. So potentially we could be measuring the same individual repeatedly who's jumping up onto this box a number of times. The thermal camera images that they used did have better success, so the models were more successful at predicting correct footpad score. Thermal cameras are still extremely expensive. But there's the potential to use this to improve welfare commercially with further research. And again, perhaps this could be paired with your RFID sensors or similar, so you could track individuals when they were on the box and get their footpad scores, so we would know if we were repeatedly scoring the same individual or if they were new individuals. And last, I'd just like to talk a bit about vocalizations. Vocalizations could be quite. So if we look at our broilers, there's 4 primary vocalizations that have been characterized and pleasure notes. And we can automatically monitor and automatically get these categorized at a flock level. But if we're going to use this to detect any welfare issues, we have to know what normal levels of each of these vocalizations are. And also know things like, do the vocalization the effects of. And work has been done on this recently, and vocalizations did have very distinct diurnal rhythms, and they kept these diurnal rhythms even as the broilers aged. And interestingly, the short peep vocalization was associated with active behavior, and the amount of this vocalization decreased as broilers age and also reduced activity. So this could be used as an indicator of welfare. Reduced activity is a sign of increased lameness and potentially increased foot and hock lesions in broilers. So reduction in this vocalization could indicate, but as broilers age, they are going to slow down. So we have to also determine how much of a decrease in the short peep might be okay, or might be the point where we're saying this is a normal age-related change as well. Didn't change vocalizations. They used was to increase heat from 22 to 32 degrees C for 6 hours a day over 10 days. So they subjected the birds to heat stress. And stress isn't going to affect the vocalizations. Will it still be able to detect other welfare issues? And in this study, the enriched environments didn't affect vocalizations either. So there wasn't a change perhaps indicating positive or better welfare. However, other studies did find things like reduced vocalizations in enriched environments compared to non-enriched environments. So again, more research here is needed to get the fundamentals of vocalizations and how they change before they can be applied. But it's very promising and a fairly inexpensive and easy way to automatically detect potential welfare issues that we can then remedy in real time. And this might be easier and cheaper to apply in commercial flocks than some other automated technology currently. And overall, in the ideal world, using multiple automated methods might improve scope for individual bird welfare assessment, which is what we would like ideally, even if it is difficult. Each animal has welfare that needs to be accounted for. So that's what I wanted to mention to you today. I'm happy to have any further discussions or take any questions about this. And I believe you'll get handouts of my slide, but I also included some of the references if you're interested in looking into any of these things further in the future. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you very much, Dr. Laura Dixon, for such a wonderful presentation. It clears all the points from welfare concerns. So thank you very much once again for joining us. I would now like to move to our Q&A session. And I would like to invite Ms. Anika Imtiaz. She is our research and academic coordinator at PPS, and she's doing her MPhil at Yuzheng Agriculture University, China. So now it's over to you, Anika Imtiaz.
Hello everyone, I hope I am audible.
Okay.
Yep.
I welcome you all once again to our Society Webinar Series 2025. And I'm Anika Imtiaz, Research and Academic Coordinator, PPS. And it's my pleasure to guide you through this important session. So we are now opening to the floor for the question, answers, and discussion. I warmly invite you to share your questions and insights. And before I head upon to the question answer session, I would like to thank Dr. Laura Dixon for such an insightful session It was really an amazing session, and I personally liked it a lot. A lot of my questions were cleared during this
Yeah, it's
session.
me, Dr. Osman.
So
That's
thank
right,
you so
Dr.
much.
Osman.
Let's head up on to the questions. Dr. Hasban, please close your mic.
It's okay
Okay.
now, Anika.
So let's move on to the question, if you permit me. So let's start. Okay. So my first question is by Dr. Faisal Rafiq. He wants to ask, how is the feed restriction managed to balance welfare with reproductive performance?
Yes, so feed restriction is mainly used in the broiler breeders, so the parent stock of the broiler chickens. Now, you might sometimes see feed restriction, or perhaps we wouldn't maybe consider it restriction, but we'd hold feed levels constant, perhaps in our laying flocks and our broiler flocks, so we wouldn't increase feed to slow growth down in those if needed. But that's a lot less common in management, and it tends to be the broiler breeders. So broiler breeders grow just like the broilers. So they grow very fast. They put on muscle tissue very quickly, but they have to live a lot longer than broilers, and they have to have good reproductive ability. So if we fed them like we fed broilers, so if we let them eat as much as they want, they would have the same welfare issues as broilers. They would have the increased mortality, increased lameness, and their reproductive performance would be quite poor. So traditionally, what has been happening is the broiler breeders get feed restricted, especially during their growth period, so about 11 to 15 weeks. And they get fed about 1/3 of what they would choose to eat ad libitum. So that's quite severe restriction. Now, this leads to a bird that is actually physically extremely healthy. So they don't have any of the welfare issues of broilers. They're quite agile. They don't tend to be lame. They have good mortality levels. But this is where we come into issues with the mental health aspect of welfare. So these birds show a lot of behaviors indicative of chronic hunger. So they might do abnormal or stereotypic behaviors. They do a lot of pacing. If we allowed them to drink as much water they would want, they would overdrink on water. So we'd call it polydipsia, and try to achieve gut fill via that. So they're also often water restricted. Now, we've done work with various broiler breeder companies, and again, they recognize that this is a welfare issue for the broiler breeders, and there is research in trying to either decrease the amount of restriction, and that might be by adding things that are higher in fiber, so bulking out the food. So the birds can eat more, but they're not getting high nutrition, so the growth is still being slowed, and their health is still very good. Or they might try things like changing the protein and energy ratios of the food as well. So again, the birds can eat larger portions but not grow as quickly. And they've even just tried increasing the growth rate of broiler breeders. So can we just feed them a bit more of our normal food, let them grow faster? And then will they still be able to reproduce as well? And so this is something that I think is going to eventually change with our broiler breeders. We won't be seeing feed restriction, or not as severe feed restriction, but it is certainly a difficult balance, because we actually call it the broiler breeder paradox, because broiler breeders are physically very healthy birds but mentally very unhealthy birds. So it's something that we're working on, and something that the breeding companies themselves are eager to look into and try to change.
Okay, thank you so much for such a comprehensive answer. So I hope, Dr. Faisal Rafiq, you got your answer. Moving ahead, our next question is by Dr. Ajad Hussain. He's asking, how do different feed resources, just like protein sources, energy resources, and also humanly skilled, just like housing system, impact the growth, performance, and bird welfare?
Yes. So if we're talking about broilers, broiler food has been researched and designed, to the nth degree, to have a very precise formula to maximize the growth of the birds. Now, the broilers themselves will eat, say, food with lower energy, lower protein, and they'll be fine, but it will decrease the growth rate. And that means they're not as productive. They're costing more to rear because they're eating more food. One of the potential advantages, and again, this needs more research, of your slower growing or intermediate broilers is they tend to be a bit more robust about what you're feeding them. So you don't necessarily need to feed them feed that's as high a quality as you would a faster growing bird, and they'll still maintain their growth curves, their production parameters. So we could certainly use feeding of different resources, say to slow reach your slaughter weight, so you're not able to produce as many. Of course, a big part of animal welfare is the people caring for them. And you can go into any system, and depending on the management and the people involved, you can see a really good system where welfare is pretty good, or you can see a really poor system. So, of course, anything that we're talking about needs good stockmanship, good people, good observation of the birds and management for welfare to be ensured.
Okay, thank you so much. Moving on to the next question, that is by Dr. Umair Asgar. He wants to ask you about regarding looking ahead, what are the areas of poultry welfare and research you see as the most critical for improving both bird well-being and farm sustainability?
Yes, thank you. It's growing birds. It tends to be quite environmentally sustainable. But of course, there's lots of welfare issues with doing this. And I have colleagues I work with at SRUC, and one of the things that they're looking at is using alternative feed sources. So one of the largest environmental footprints with broilers tends to be within their feed. Say for us, it's importing soya. That's extremely, expensive, but it's also very bad for the environment. It's not sustainable. So research involving feeding things like legumes here, barley, various types of more locally sourced feed ingredients, and replacing the very expensive and less environmentally sustainable aspects of poultry feed. And I mentioned earlier that our fast-growing broilers are very sensitive to changes in the diet, so these can have production impacts. So this research isn't just looking at faster growing broilers, it's also looking at the slower growing and intermediate broilers who you can do a lot better with feeding things that aren't as high quality, these locally sourced ingredients. And so you're not having as big environmental impact, but you're still getting the same amount of performance out of the bird as if you were feeding them a very high quality feed. So I think looking at more local resources, and also looking at birds who are more robust to changes that we can do more with is going to help with the bird well-being, but also sustainability.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Lara. Now I have a query about we talk about a lot about the laying hens that are in the laying phase, but we don't talk about the spent hens. So I would like to ask you about what are what do you think are the innovative strategies regarding the transport and slaughter of these spent hens, regarding the animal welfare point of view. So I would like to hear from you.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, laying hens at the end of a laying cycle are quite fragile. They've taken calcium from their bones to put in the eggshells. And so there is research looking at the ways they are handled. This is just research that's starting, so we don't have any conclusions yet. But looking at different ways of carrying them. So catching crews tend to come in and they tend to pick the birds up by the legs, and they have a number of birds per hand, and they take them and put them in the modules for transport. And when you're a fragile bird whose bones break easily, this can lead to breakages, which then you have to sit with this broken bone through transport until you get to the slaughter plant. So they're looking at different methods of catching, or even different numbers. So instead of, say, catching 3 birds per hand, what if you caught 2 per hand? What if you just caught 1 per hand? And then what does that do in terms of how long it takes the catching crew? And how long the birds then have to sit in the modules before transport. So trying to find a happy medium between methods of catching the birds where we're not going to damage them as much, but also where we're not delaying the time to get to the slaughter plant, or we're not increasing this overall process too much. We also have some research looking at automated methods of clearing burns. So this would need to be built into the system. So, newer systems could do this. but you can get systems where the floor is kind of like a conveyor belt. And of course, you could still put litter on it or whatnot, but at the end of the laying cycle, this conveyor belt floor moves and it takes the birds and it takes them along and deposits them into the catching modules itself. So the human handling isn't there. And this does seem to, again, improve the birds in terms of bone breakages, in terms of stress. It does quite expensive to set up right now. So I think this is a technology that if it gets more common, if the cost comes down a bit, and certainly as new production systems that are being built, it could be incorporated and be quite helpful. But it's a bit not practical at the moment for most producers.
Okay, thank you so much. So another question I have is regarding the males in the female, for the layer chicks. So in most of the countries they macerate the male chicks, which is totally inhumane. So what is your approach regarding this? What do you think the male chicks should treated?
Yes, so that's actually an area of interest as well. And again, a lot of the research into this is just starting, but they're looking at using the male laying hens as a meat bird, but as a different type of meat bird than your broiler. So they're calling them dual purpose birds. And these would be more likened to before we started really heavily selecting birds for meat and eggs, we tended to have these dual purpose birds. So the girls would lay eggs, the boys would eat and get fattened a bit and then be slaughtered for food. So there's a lot of interest, especially with a lot of our animal welfare charities, in looking to see, can we kind of bring back this dual purpose male from the laying hen line? So what happens if we keep them and we feed them, say, a very nutritious diet, like we might do a broiler? What's their growth rate? What's their kind of, the production parameters? How much meat are they producing? What's the taste like, of course, because you have to have somebody who wants to eat it as well. And so this is being seen as a possible way. So instead of, hatching, tens of thousands of chicks just to immediately kill them, we can perhaps then use them and put them in as part of, the need for a lean protein, a good quality protein that could, again, potentially not be too expensive for the consumers. So I think that's a very promising way. And it's certainly what used to happen in poultry production before it got, very technical and advanced.
Okay, thank you so much. There are some research regarding the sex determination at the embryonic stage. So,
Yes.
what do you think? Is it a better way than macerating or raising them as a dual purpose bird? Of course, it's expensive and it's not very much practical in the field right now. But what's your approach regarding this?
Yes, I think that there's different types of technology, but the in ovo sexing that can sex the birds before they would be considered what we would call sentient. So they're not alive yet. The welfare isn't an issue. So if they can sex the birds at that point, and then any eggs that were going to develop into male chicks could just be destroyed, I don't have a welfare concern at all about that. And some countries, again, Germany seems to be very into their animal welfare changes. They're doing things like banning chick maceration and requiring in ovo sexing. Like you said, cost is a major issue right now, and also the accuracy or how good the machine is at saying this is a male and it is a male. It's not quite, I think most people feel it's not quite where it needs to be practical commercially. So it's still making too many mistakes right now. I think that it could be very useful. And I think once the technology gets more common, the cost is going to come down. And I think it could be a very practical way to just decrease the numbers of male chicks that we end up hatching out and either say keeping for meat or using for breeding purposes.
Okay. Thank you so much for clarifying my queries actually. So moving on to the
Absolutely.
last question, that is by Dr. Muhammad Rashid. He wants to ask regarding the welfare point of view, which method is best for trimming of beak and through which method? You think is the better for?
Absolutely. So the two main methods are infrared beak trimming, where a laser is shot at the tip of the beak. It destroys the tissue eventually sloughs off. Hot blade trimming is using a what it sounds like a hot blade. It cuts through the end of the beak and it cauterizes. Without a doubt, infrared beak trimming is much better for bird welfare. It still does cause some pain for the birds, and it does affect their normal behavior for a bit. But overall, it seems to be much less damaging. Hot blade trimming can be associated with neuromas, or kind of sensitive bundles of nerves at the end of the beak. And these don't go away. So you could end up with birds that have these sensitive bundles of nerves on the end of their beak, which is going to impact their feeding. It's going to, birds basically use beaks like we use our fingers. It's how they explore the environment. And the process of the trim itself, birds that have been beak trimmed with a hot blade show a large decrease in things like feeding behavior, comfort behavior, immediately afterwards and for a while, whereas the effects are much less large with infrared beak trimming. And infrared beak trimming also can be done in an automated way at the hatchery. So, the birds get put in the carousels, they get whatever vaccinations they're needed, they get trimmed at the same time. So you don't need a separate handling, because often hot blade trimming was done by people picking the bird up again and putting it in the blade trimmer for the blade to come down. So you're also decreasing the handling stress. So definitely, if we're going to beak trim, my vote is certainly for the infrared beak treatments.
Okay, thank you so much. This came to an end of the question answer session. Thank you so much for clarifying our queries. Over to you, Dr. Syam.
Oh, thank you very much. Such a wonderful session, Q&A session with Laura Dixon. Thank you very much, Anika Imtiaz, and a very special thanks to Dr. Laura Dixon for sparing a time for our presentation today. Dr. Dixon, absolutely, the research you are doing is not only to understand the scientific truths or scientific understanding, but it also provides us the actionable insights or points that the farmers or the policymakers and even the industry stakeholders can utilize. So thank you very much. We would like to explore opportunities for future collaboration with the SRUC and with you as well in your research group. Just giving you mentioning a very few points that one of your esteemed colleague, Professor Dr. Farina Khattak, she was our guest speaker in our first international graduate research conference that was held in March 2022, 2025.
Oh, fantastic.
22nd. Now we have our second international graduate research conference in June 2026. So I really want you to be for our conference as well. Join us for the second international graduate research conference as well.
So, I'd be delighted to.
Thank you very much. One of my concerns regarding your presentation and regarding your overall topic, what challenges do developing countries in comparison with developing countries facing? In comparison with developed countries, they are facing right now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's a number of challenges. Depending on, the country you're in, you might not have the same environmental control in your buildings as there might be in other countries. So you might be, struggling with things like heat stress or maintaining litter quality. Whereas if it was a fully controlled environment, those can tend to be more easily managed. Also, sometimes availability of breeds is different depending on where you are. So you might be getting breeds that perhaps either maybe not as suitable for your environments, because again, if we have some breeds that are more robust to different temperatures than others, having access in countries where the temperature might be more of an issue could actually be more beneficial to yourselves than us just giving you, say, our fast-growing birds who do really well but are really sensitive to changes or feed types. So again, and also things, again, you might not be able to get the same types of feed ingredients that, again, these birds have been bred to do so well on. So there are certainly challenges. I will say, though, that speaking to colleagues from varying countries, sometimes you've got some really nice, more traditional or heritage breeds that I think could be used or incorporated into your breeding plans that might really help things like welfare while still getting the production or, even the, meat quality, the color of the meat, whatnot, that your local retailers might want. So I also think there's opportunities that we don't have, that you might have from these genetics that are already being used, that we could be taking advantage of and integrating.
Thank you very much for your insight, Dr. Dixon. Moving on, I want to like to introduce our webinar number 4, that is on 26 September on Friday with Professor Dr. Daniel Priest from Poultry Diagnostic Research Center, PDRC, University of Georgia, USA. He will talk on his recent work, Innovations in Poultry Vaccination, Live Attenuated Strategies Against Bird Flu. So I would like to invite all of the participants who are attending this webinar to join us for our last session with Professor Dr. Daniel Priest on 26 September. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Laura Dixon and the participants who are attending this session.